So for this roundtable, we're going to be talking about the constraints in terms of supply and demand for mass catering. We have 5 people on the stage. We've got Pierre-Noël CANITROT, who's in charge of food in the PACA region, and he's going to draw up a portrait of what's going on in his part of France, so I'd like to thank him. We've got Christian ROCCI, who is in charge of agriculture for the city of Avignon. And we have a representative of the Jardins de Solène, which is one of those AMAP type enterprises. And the motivations for Avignon to enhance their local supply. We've also got Pauline MARTY, who's a lecturer in geography and town planning at the University in Troyes in France, and she's going to be telling us about evolutions over the past few years. She's been a consultant for different regional authorities. And then there's Valérie ANGEON, who's an economist, and she's a research manager at INRA Ecodéveloppement, and she's going to talk us how the European law is adapted to Guadeloupe. I will be running this round table, and I'm just keeping the information flowing, the conversation going. It's really important to say that we built this round table all together with the participants, and so we'll be broaching these subjects collectively. I'm going to try and be invisible here and allow my guest experts to speak out. So I'll just keep the conversation on track. This will last for an hour, and then we'll have half an hour to chat. You can ask questions to all of the speakers. And there we go. So without further ado, I'm going to hand the floor over to my experts. Hello, everybody. I'm delighted to be with you today. I'm Pierre-Noël CANITROT from the food department in PACA. It's a government department. I am going to present to you the food policy that we have for France. But first of all, because there are a lot of participants here who aren't that familiar with what's going on here in France, I'm going to give a quick lowdown of what's been happening. At the end of the Second World War, France was hungry, and our farmers were asked to produce food for us to eat. And so there was the common agricultural policy in Europe which was adopted, which encouraged all European countries to produce as much as possible. So from centuries of horses and oxen, we shifted immediately to high industrialization with a lot of chemicals. And back in the 90s, we started to wonder about what the consequences that would have on the environment. We started to wonder about the ethics of it all. And then society at that time, because the citizens were behind all this, society asked farmers to meet environmental criteria, ethical criteria. As a result of that, in Europe, rules and regulations were passed for the food law, and there's a hygiene pack in 2006. France deployed that nationally, of course, and Europe allows its states to choose their own nutritional policies. So France decided to implement a food policy, a national food policy, and then would allow each region to choose how they would put it into action. In 2010, we had some hindsight. 2010, we had the first food laws that were passed here in France. The first law was for food and farming, and it introduced into the rural code for each French citizen having a balanced diet, taking into account sustainability and respecting the environment. This was back in 2010. So the policy, and it was a philosophy, but there wasn't really an action plan. There were no main subjects to work on. So in 2014, the government and MPs were more precise. They said that we would work in 4 chapters. There was going to be social justice. Everybody would have access to a balanced diet. So that meant working a lot with mass catering from kindergartens to old folks' homes via hospitals and schools. So at some stage in your life, you're bound to be involved in mass catering. The second chapter was educating youngsters about good food. So mass catering, perhaps in universities and schools, would have a role to play there. The third was against food waste. It was again this question of environmental ethics here, because it's unacceptable to waste resources. And the final chapter was locality, to make farming local again. So we were looking at things slightly differently, because for decades we'd been telling farmers to go out to international markets and export their produce, but now we're saying we want to have more local farming. So we're changing the way that we are looking at things, but that is in response to what society is after now. More recently still, we had the Egalim law here in France. It's called Egalim because it has filtered down from some great debates that we had about diet. President Macron, when he was made president, had a lot of discussions about food. That's really new here in France. It was quite an innovation because we've got a strong history in France, and so here we started to look at things through the perspective of food. It was a very successful meeting. There were meetings on a national scale, there were meetings on a regional scale, and a lot of time was spent working on this question. And as a result of all of those discussions, we had this Egalim law. It took a year for it to be produced. The MPs talked about every single aspect of it, and now we really do know that it's an important law. It took a whole year for it to be approved. So I am now just going to modify what Esther said earlier on at the beginning of our morning here. We are not talking about local in this Egalim law, because that is forbidden on a European scale. We cannot favour one state or one region within Europe. That's just against European law. So in the Egalim French law, we don't talk about local resources, but we do keep in mind that one of the goals of good food is to relocate where our food comes from. So one of the big innovations of this law is to improve the quality of food in mass catering. A school canteen or a university or hospital canteen is a place where one spends time and where it is easy to educate your diners. And we can improve the quality, but to do so you need a framework, you need clear definitions. We've seen 2 already. In terms of politics, there's even more definitions. So the Parliament decided to use labels to identify where a product comes from. They correspond either to French or to European specs. You can see them on the screen here, the different labels. You probably recognize quite a few of them. I'm not going to go into detail unless you have any specific questions, but 20% are organic. So we really do focus on organics. One of the Agriculture and Food Ministry's policies is to promote organic farming. Dr. Brinkley was talking about this earlier on. It's a much broader system than simply organic farming. It's just more detailed. There are other labels which have been selected, sustainable fishing, for example, and there's a label for areas that French overseas territories. We've got high environmental value. There's got a farm-laid stamp for eggs. These labels have specs. They're quite easy to describe them in a public procurement contract. However, what about foodstuffs which do not have a label, because local food can be local without having one of these labels, of course. So we can't talk about these local neighbourhoods, as I've said, but how do you help the local producers? It's a bit of a trick. So we found a way of wording it. It's a clever way of wording it, and it defines what sustainable development is for Europe. It's a product that is acquired taking into account the environmental externalities, i.e. what's the impact of the product on the environment. So we can't put any figures on this. Work is underway. There's the environmental agency is working on this. But right now, this is a criterion that we cannot use in when we're placing our orders. So this mass catering law is for 2022. For the time being, in our department, we don't think we'll be able to use this criterion then either. So we are currently suggesting that mass catering buyers focus on organic farming or the farms that are converting, because there's a very strong movement here in France. All of the regional agricultural chambers are behind that, and also focusing on high environmental value. So there we go as far as the law is concerned. We want to foster and favour quality, and if that comes locally, then that's all the better. But you cannot just choose a local supplier because he or she is local. So that was from a national point of view. Now if we take a look regionally now, what's the situation there? In regional terms, we've got about 4,000 kitchens for mass catering. That means a lot of establishments. And they produce over 250 million meals. We're talking about mass catering in the largest sense of the word. We've got kindergarten, schools, hospitals, retirement homes, there's the army, there's the prisons, there are businesses, government authorities. It's not as simple as when you're working on a single school or a single establishment, or 10 schools, for example, where it's easy to get hold of data about sourcing and budgets. But so going out to meet all 4,000 parties involved in preparing these meals is a bit of a tall order. So in some regions of France, we've decided to set up some observatories. In Paris, for example, there are over 6,000 establishments which we're looking at. The return of information is quite low and applies mainly to those establishments that are already involved in improving their own quality. So the results are slightly skewed. However, that's the strategy as it is, but we've decided not to work with those observatories because we felt it's not a true picture of what's going out in the field. So in our region, in the PACA, we've gone about things differently. We don't have a diagnosis about the over 4,000 kitchens to identify how they go about sourcing local quality ingredients. Each local authority, each establishment has its own policy. It could be the policy of that establishment or the policy of the head chef, because the head chef might be sensitive about a certain issue. And we find it really hard to get hold of the statistics. So that is from the point of view of the buyers. But if we look at supply now, switching away from demand. If you're not familiar with France, this is the region called PACA. There is great differences between the northeast, where there are mountains and where we will find meat and dairy farms. They do exist. They're not a lot, granted, but they're not industrial facilities by any means. They're small farms up in the mountains. But then if you look to the west of the PACA region, we do have more production. We've got these big companies, large-scale farms, which export their goods and have been doing so for decades, and which are not necessarily interested in the mass catering market. PACA is the biggest producer of pears, courgettes, apples, melons, apricots. So production in our region, PACA, is there. We do have the production. The question remains is how are we going to use that? Where are the farmers going to sell their produce, and to whom? Now let's move on to the next file, the next picture. So we don't have a very clear idea of what our buyers' needs are. We're going to have to convince the producers that it's to their advantage to sell to mass catering companies. There are some wholesalers, of course. There are logistics companies, the transporters, because a farmer, let's not forget this, a farmer carries out his trade. A logistics manager does his trade, which is completely different. So we are asking farmers we're asking farmers to do everything. We're asking the farmers to produce, to respond to calls for orders, to put in their tenders, to organise the logistics. It's just not feasible. It's not long-lasting. If we don't manage to allow farmers to concentrate on the farming, the logistics people to concentrate on the logistics, and all the buyers to concentrate on their speciality, if we don't do that, well, we're not going to manage to make the system work. So we set up mid-scale systems. And we've created them thanks to a law which was passed in 2014, and we implemented them in 2016. And the idea behind this is to create a bridge between production and consumption at the end of the day, in the broadest term. So this is a mid-scale project. Most of these mid-scale projects in France focus on mass catering for schools and other establishments like that, because in political terms it's one way of showcasing your efforts in the food arena. And when you're talking about food, the first link in the chain is farming. And there's also a question of town planning. Do we want farmland in our region or not? If we do have it, what are we going to do with it? I don't know if you remember the map which I showed you in the previous scale of the PACA region. There's a lot of grapes growing for wine, for example. We've got olives, we've got lots of honey, we've got flowers for the perfume industry. We've got a Mediterranean type of fruits, for example. But is that what mass catering is looking for? So setting up farmers on land which is worth its weight in gold is quite a decision to take. If you have to be politically committed to see these mid-scale food plans through all the way. So our region, the map is on the screen there, with 50%, 56% of the population is involved in a mid-scale scheme. 50% of the land is. The projects are advancing, some faster than others. There's a mid-scale policy for Aix, Marseille and Arles, which covers the entire Bouches-du-Rhône department. If you were to get all of the players involved in food for your department, it's quite a challenge. And I'm sure you realize it will take a lot of time. So it's very difficult to implement actions when all of the different players have to change the way they work, really. But things are moving forward in PACA. We've got farmers in our region. We're not the same as in Brittany. In Brittany, you've got all of your industries which are clearly defined. And in PACA, our farmers have chosen their specific niche, their sector. We don't have very many specializations. There are just a small number of them. So we have to work a lot with the producers, not only the buyers, but we also have to work with the producers so that they can get into a structure and they can rise to those demands that are made upon them. The overall idea is to help our producers grow towards these labels and organics. That would be a response to what is required in France as in general, not only for mass catering. This afternoon, we are going to be talking about the middlemen, if you like, the intermediaries. We will have several examples of bringing supply and demand together. Now, I'd like Mr. ROCCI to now give us some information about what happens here in Avignon. What do you do about structuring the different players? So, what is your strategy in your canteens, for example? Hello, everybody. Well, I'm sure you've heard talk of the cooking that we do here in Avignon. I'm going to talk to you about how we've managed to get where we are. Am I going too fast for the interpreters? No, everything's fine. Thank you very much. So first of all, when Mrs. Cécile Hellel was elected as mayor of Avignon, she immediately, in her first projects, decided to bring the central kitchens under the control of the town hall to ensure that the children were eating better in schools. So we started to work on some directives to this end with the head of the kitchens, and we had to build everything from scratch again. It wasn't enough just to change the personnel. We had to set up contracts. We had to address questions of health and safety, hygiene. We had to change all the equipment in the kitchens, in the central kitchen, and it was a big project. It was a success, thanks to the men and women who really did get involved, particularly those in the central kitchen, who dedicated all of their time to the success of this project. So after the first few years, we reached our cruising speed, and we were able then to improve our relationships with the growers, with the producers. We wanted to change the way we were going about things. So we got in touch with the Chamber of Agriculture. We met people with different projects, and we all got around the table and we all tried to work together. The common denominator was that we talked. The producers were talking with those people who needed the produce. So we had to get to know one another, and we had to move forward with all of the different projects that we had set up. So if I were to sum up this project, I must say that the conclusions are positive. Our central kitchen and the manager, Hugues Fortuna, who is with us here, have a great reputation now, and their work has been recognized. There have been many TV reports, including one which was quite large scale. There was Élise Lucet, a famous French journalist who came to do a program in our kitchens. And all of a sudden, we saw Avignon, the bridge in Avignon, and this famous journalist demonstrated that we can cook differently in schools, and it was great to have a positive point of view from her because she's often quite harsh in her judgment. So we were very pleased to have our new way of going about things highlighted on the television here in France. So it was important to talk to many people, and thanks to that, we could have joint projects. And I would like to talk about some initiatives we took with some of the growers. We didn't limit our work to the central kitchen. We went out and about to all of the different farmlands in the region, and we got hold of a lot of spare land which we were able to give back to the growers. So in just a stone's throw away from here, there's an agro park. There was some spare land. It hadn't been built on, and it was made, the town hall decided to make it available to young farmers, to the agricultural high school, to other farmers with sheep, for example. The second point is that link from the east to the west. There's a main road which runs through Avignon. It runs through the green part of Avignon so that people don't have to drive through the ancient city centre. And in that zone also there are about 30 hectares which had been reclaimed. The farmers had to sell their land. And in the meantime, they would continue to work on their land, but some abandoned their land, and they just became wasteland, really. So we managed to sign an agreement with the DRAAF, which meant that young farmers could use that abandoned land. And so we set up a first grower, and then the program switched slightly. The DRAAF no longer wanted to give the housing that went with the land, but leaving that land all on its own without anyone living on it was a bit of a danger, because while the farmer went home at night to his own home, people would nip onto his land and pinch all the produce, so that wasn't a very good idea. There was a young farmer who was able to buy an agricultural property on the road to Tarascon, and he's been there up and running since then, and he grows organic produce from that land, and that's the way he works, and he's really happy about that. We also work with the Chamber of Agriculture to install automatic machines to sell foodstuffs on the car park, on one of the car parks. They're kind of little huts, if you like, nothing too glamorous. And inside the hut, there are these automatic distribution machines from which you can buy your food, and that was done hand in hand with the Chamber of Agriculture and also the County Council. And these installations mean that there's a group of growers, and that's quite a difficult thing to achieve because farmers are very individualistic mostly, but here we've managed to bring them all together. It was a very good thing. We've got about 30 growers who have got together in a grouping so that they can have a wide palette of produce that's always available in these huts and these automatic distributors. So a lot of people use them, and it's a great success.
We also set up a farmers market that is along the river, in Avignon against the city walls. And there are about 40 farmers who are there. When they have produce, of course, they come and sell their produce to all of the people who live in Avignon. That's very successful too. The city of Avignon is fully aware of this agricultural area that is often the subject of attack because, of course, people want to use this land. But since her election, the mayor has not opened a single part of this area to building, which shows the interest and care given to the farmers. So, to come back to the questions that have been raised, I think that it's difficult today to be content with the new laws that have been voted, because the big problem we have in a city such as Avignon are the public tenders that we have to issue. And when we have issued a public tender, we can't choose the people who will be providing the produce. And therefore, that is a problem, because today we're really looking to work locally and to buy organic produce. So how can we choose somebody local with a public tender that can be extended to France or beyond? So you can imagine that this is very disruptive for us. Therefore, we're obliged, and I think Mr. Fortuné will speak to you about this afternoon, we're about to put in some small clauses so that we can try and select the right producer. And it's a big problem for us in France when you want to work locally. So we also put the spotlight on a product that is Ali Local, where we work closely with Ali Local, and there was a ranking done throughout France, and the city of Avignon was the winner for schools. There were other winners that were for high schools and middle schools, other establishments such as hospitals, but the city of Avignon has been chosen as the biggest purchaser of local produce for primary schools. So that made us very happy, and we received that reward in Marseille. And we were very happy with this. We took some nice photos. And so it really puts a spotlight on local farming, and it allows us also to maintain very good relationships with all of these farmers. I can quote a farmer that we met and who gave us some young lettuces. So he used to sow strips per colour, and we wanted a mixture of colours, so he decided to create a strip with all mixes of colours, and that was dedicated to the city of Avignon. So when we talk with people, with the farmers, they find good solutions. Micro. As Solène is behind, next to me, I don't want to cut off her speaking time. I'm available to you to answer any questions. But with regard to our central kitchen, we'll be talking about this afternoon to explain how we've worked. So I'm going to pass the microphone to Solène. Hello, everybody. Thank you for being here with us. I'm Solène Hospitalet. I'm the founder of the Jardins de Solène. And maybe I'm going to very briefly give you a bit of background to see how we got where we are today. So I worked directly with farmers via a structure called Solid Agri, which still exists. And it's a slightly different sort of structure. It doesn't quite fit within the frame because we recruit people who have a disability, in particular a slight intellectual deficiency, in order to help the farmers. So we go to the farmers, to their land, and we plant lettuces, courgettes, we prune the vines, etc. And we've been doing this since 2008. Within the framework of this activity, which we still have, we realized, and it was a very, very significant finding, is that there was a lot of food waste. So farmers today are have to work with very strict specifications with regard to the caliber, the color of the products, the size, and their shape. Just to give you a very concrete example, if a courgette is bent, then it does not comply with the buyer's specifications. So unless it's a small structure, a small farm that can go and sell the produce on a local market, they don't have any other outlet for these products. So most of the time, these vegetables are destroyed. But today, when we were thinking about these questions in 2013 and 2014, and we talked about it to people around us and said, well, we could eat these products, and it's just really silly for everybody to throw them away. But it was impossible because these so-called declassified produce were not edible in people's minds. Things have changed, of course, significantly, although the change is very recent. So that was the first finding that made us want to do something about it. The second finding comes to the fact that I'm elected in a small town, and we look after underprivileged populations who don't have enough to eat. And there is a real issue here, especially in the PACA region and in the Vaucluse department. It's a very poor department, and there's a real problem for access to local, fresh, seasonal, healthy produce. So that was a real problem. And there's what the gentleman was talking about earlier on also, is that there's a problem of territorial anchorage. So we're not going to go back over the actual law itself, but as Christian said, we have a real problem. And it's wonderful to create territorial food plans, etc., because there is a real problem at the European level. We are not allowed, according to European regulations, to have a local territorial preference. And that will remain a problem because, as Christian said, organic food is wonderful. But once again, organic potatoes that come from Holland, there's nothing super about that. So, of course, this is my personal opinion, but I have producers who work very well. They're not organic, but they have very reasonable farming practices, and they're just 20 kilometers down the road. So if we really think about environmental externalities, it is a real issue that we are not allowed to take that into account. Yes, I'm not going to spend more time, but all of this just to say that, yeah, we can put the spotlight on the progress, but as long as we don't change things at the European level, we will keep coming up against this wall. So, as the gentleman was saying as well, farmers cannot be distributors, logistics specialists, buyers, and specialists in public procurement. And so, coming back to things that we did before, there is a lack of intermediates in the territory, but not 15,000, because otherwise we'll be coming back to the problems of added value with regard to the initial produce, which means that they become inaccessible. But at least we need one intermediate, and that's what we created with the Jardins de Solène. The idea was to be the actual interface between producers and buyers, in particular mass catering, for all of the challenges that the gentleman talked about, for example, education on food. And so we created a processing lab in Pierre-la-Fontaine, about 20 kilometers from here, where we buy the declassified products from farmers. So it's not a donation economy. We buy the vegetables from them. So the idea is to bring the value back to the people who actually produce the food and who feed people. We peel and wash the products, and we cut them up in pieces, or we grate them according to the needs of mass catering and in the future private individuals. So we vacuum pack them, and it's thanks to vacuum packing that we can make sure that they remain fresh for about 7 days, and they're products that are ready to use or to cook. And Hugo will be talking about that this afternoon. The idea is also really to bring the value back upstream, downstream. In collective restaurants, their job is to cook. So we've got rid of this intermediate task so that they can concentrate on their real job. Yes, a lot of kitchens actually don't have a vegetable workshop, so they can't decontaminate, peel and cut their vegetables. So it's within this context that Solène's work is very important. Yes, indeed. We did some studies and we found the same thing as what the gentleman mentioned earlier on. And there are a lot of mass catering restaurants, either that are not equipped or they don't have enough equipment, or they don't have the manpower, because in terms of public policies and funding, there are real constraints for mass catering restaurants and the authorities. So there is a real need in the territories. And this is a rather general finding. And this is why we created this lab, which is a processing lab, in 2017. And I'm stepping out of the framework here for 2 seconds, but actually you've talked a lot about food, and you'll be talking about it over the coming 2 days, but it really touches us all, but it therefore affects a lot of different areas. The economic side of things, but then there's also the territorial strategy, hence the territorial food plans. Health also, I think that Mr. Verger will be talking about health and nutritional questions. So therefore it is a very big stake. Therefore we adopted that approach because we work within the social and solidarity economy. So just to talk about food waste, we also recruit people in difficulty, and we also have a zero waste policy, because the peelings that come from our lab are used by a partner company that makes compost. And also for the logistics, because there are real logistic questions with regard to the local system. So we're setting up innovative partners. On small distances, we have a partner that delivers by bike, so zero carbon footprint. And therefore, for more distant orders, we pool our logistics means with logistics specialists, in particular La Poste, because they go to all of the small towns, the French post office, and they're trying to optimize logistics. So we can pool these logistics and reduce the carbon footprint of transport. I just have one thing to say. We have to be aware that Solène, with her action and what she's done, in 2018 won the Social and Solidarity Economy Award. So we should congratulate her for that. So I'd now like to pass the floor to Pauline MARTY, who just talked about in the systemic approach. And so how do you see the evolution of this question, if it's approached in this upstream manner by a few actors or not? Thank you. Good morning, everybody. So I'm Pauline MARTY. I'm a lecturer in the University of Technologie 3, and I did my PhD between 2008 and 2013, in particular on the question of local school and sustainable school canteens within the framework of the city Brive-la-Gaillarde. I was both a PhD student and I worked for the authorities who were responsible for rolling out this program. And during that time, within the same framework, I participated in a work group of the Associations of the Mayors of France, with a collective association that was a pioneer between 2008 and 2010, And then I worked in consulting in order to finance the end of my PhD on that subject with local authorities. Generally speaking, since the 2010, the issues are quite similar. The vocabulary, however, has changed. So today there's a real fabric in the players' minds of a horizontality of the food issue. And then there's the question of the sustainability of a territory with it. At the time, we said, well, put public procurement in the service of the development of local sectors. We used an argument of the sort, 10% of GDP comes from public procurements. And the idea was that the authorities could create a sort of a cash flow of a basic business for these sectors, who could then develop other local outlets for. So there were some places where it worked and others not. There was also the idea of changing the way people viewed local produce, because we have this wonderful history in France of producing local produce, which are the object of AOPs and etc. In Brive, that's in a mountainous area in the Massif Central, and the three main specialities are some fruits, but we're not as good as PACA region. Otherwise, we produce Limousin beef, so niche products. And so the question was the fact that we need far more variety within the school canteen. So we need to really work with all different sectors. So the problem with public procurement, I'm going to talk about it very quickly because I know you'll be talking about this afternoon. There was something interesting came out of the work group of the Association of Mayors of France. At the time, it was managed by Jacques Pélissard, with the example of the city of Nancy, who made a lot of progress, although they remained entirely illegal with regard to public procurement law. But since he's been president of the Association of the Mayors of France, he's not, really bothered by the law. But this ban on local preferences comes from European law, so we're touching here upon the core of the European construction. So the fact of trying to promote a change in law will not work, so we have to adopt a practical approach, which is how can we modify, introduce into our public procurement technical elements that allow our local candidates to really enhance the interest of local produce in terms of freshness, a lower carbon footprint, etc. So what is really horizontal with regard to this question from 2008 to today is really the question of governance, the question of bringing all of the different players together around the table, of learning from each other. So the elected representatives learning from the organic sphere, etc. And therefore to take into account the very tricky constraints of a farm and, on the other end, a school canteen. So I mostly worked with the local authorities and not very much with the groups of farmers who, and so on the side of the authorities, things really got off the ground in 2008 after the environmental plan in France. And there was a study by the French Electricity Board at that time which showed that 60% of the programs for municipal elections of 2008 included a question of organics or local produce in the canteen. So it was just the beginnings. There were pious wishes. We didn't have a lot of technical know-how around this, but it gathered pace very quickly because around 2010, a lot of authorities created territorial planning systems to manage the urban-rural interface, and there are real rural-urban alliances that were organized, and farming was seen as an integrating factor. So this is what initiated this process. However, it didn't always go down very well because school canteens remain really a place where the town hall manages everything. So things came from the town, but nobody really had a solution. But what did work very quickly is when there were active farmers' networks. And and who understood that the towns wanted to work with local farmers with an entry into everything that's local and not any given type of produce. So eat local, eat organic. And so there were groups of farmers such as Valbio Centre. There are some 20 or so smallholders. And they said, well, we provide baskets of local seasonal produce for consumers, so why not do the same thing for schools? So it's very difficult to bring everyone around the table, however. And one thing I did note is that in 2008, we really believed that it would require multiplayer alliances, typically what's happening with the Jardins de Solène and Avignon. So there are new systems and alliances to be invented, and I think it's very interesting because some are up and running and they work very well. That's brilliant. But I think it's also very interesting because it questions the horizontality of public action, because you're not in the same, you don't tend to the same people for food or for farming or schools. And it's quite exciting to say, well, actually we're bringing about a change in the global model. So it's local sustainable development that is also socially inclusive. So you have 2-3 minutes before we pass the floor to Valérie. So 2-3 minutes. Oh, I had so much to say. I'm not sure. Esther, do you want to guide me towards a particular point? I would like you to talk about the obstacles that prevent us from bringing more local produce into our school canteens.
Pas de souci. Non, mais c'est pas grave. C'est ça. Oui, c'est sympa, un petit interlude musical. Donc voilà. Donc sur les points bloquants.
So regarding the obstacles, unfortunately, they were the same then as they are now. So there's a very big question about facilities for the towns. What is your central kitchen? Is it public management or is it outsourced? So when it's managed by the city itself, you can oblige the providers to have local produce, but we can't control quality. So you've already talked about that. So that's a problem on the side of the local authorities. But also for the farmers, of course, we made a lot of headway on creating networks and structuring the sector, but the real challenge is how far can we adapt within the system? Do we need an intermediate? What is the role played by the intermediate, or can the constraints be dealt with by the producer or by the kitchen? So there is a real challenge here, and that's been the case over the past 10 years. We need to do a refined, lengthy work for each product, for each authority, with each type of farmers network that we're working with. And therefore that requires a lot of governance, negotiation and mutual understanding. So there is the schedule and the way in which the farm operates, which is very different from how a school canteen operates. So an example is poultry production. In the centre region, there was organic poultry farmers who were ready to produce ready-to-cook poultry for schools and high schools of the region and the department, but it had to enter within the framework of poultry production, which comes in a cycle. So we had to work upstream for the orders. And then the cooks realized that the red label poultry that was 120 days old was very difficult to cut into the grammage that was required in school canteens. So it took 6 to 8 months of discussion to reach the solution. The fact that some of the poultry goes later into the batch, they come out at 104 days and not 120, they are raised like red label chickens, but they can be cut into the right grammage. So local dairy produce is often very expensive because of the packaging. But if we have 5 kilo pots of yogurt, for example, do we have the time and the manpower necessary in the canteens to put it into individual portions? So we need to look at all of this in order to allow the cooks and the farmers to work well. And there's a question of the supply, storage and logistics. Who can look after what? Regarding meat, there's a big challenge around the maintenance of local slaughterhouses. The problem is, what meat do we order so we don't destabilize the sector, because canteens might tend to use only front pieces, whereas we have to also grow the value of the carcasses, use the carcasses. So who stores the meat in order to smooth out the supply chain? And then there's a problem, different regulatory constraints. There are constraints in terms of the delivery of products to the labs. The kitchen needs the goods to arrive at 8 o'clock in the morning because otherwise they won't have time to deal with it, and then we have to respect the cold chain. So all of these different technical solutions, the farmers are not familiar with them. It's not their job. So if we don't take the time to look at all of these, we only identify the obstacles without actually finding intelligent solutions. There's the question of volumes. The poor nutritionists who have so many rules to establish the menus over the 20 or 21 days. How can we bring local produce into it? Well, maybe we've planned to have apples, but actually we get pears. So can we have apples in one restaurant, one canteen, and pears in another? How do we manage that with the parents? It requires a bit of flexibility. And then there's the financial challenge. We have market gardeners who sell on the market at wholesale markets. We can't at retail prices, and we can't ask them to give away all of their produce at wholesale prices to the canteens. Then there's the value and the motivation of the civil servants. Our head cook was very informed, and he put all of his energy into the hygiene and sanitation questions. So when he received organic carrots that were not well washed, it really upset his organization, and he just couldn't cope with it. So there's a learning process to go into this. And I think, well, I talked a lot about the kitchens themselves, but within rural communes, the most innovative projects that go the furthest are those where the towns really bet on the autonomy of the canteens with a real cook, small scale, so we can see that we can rely upon, this local logistics of farmers who come and drop off their kids at school in order to actually create a logistics chain. Thank you, Pauline, for this very clear summary of the obstacles. So that's preliminary to the conclusions that we will draw, and that we'll be developing further this afternoon in the round table around public procurement, and the third round table with the mediation structures and what levers can we find. So, Valérie, I would like you to explain how this ANIM law that we talked about is adapted in Guadeloupe, and what are the obstacles to the food supply in Guadeloupe?
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Esther. I'm Valérie ANGEON. I'm an economist. Thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this seminary, which is all about a transversal issue. It covers many territories, a question of securing food sources on a mid-scale and other scales. I'm going to take you to another part of the Mediterranean. It's the American Mediterranean, if you like. I'm going to take you to the Caribbean area, which has many parallels with the Mediterranean insofar as it's a sea in the middle of the land. It's a place where people travel through. It's a place for trading. It's a cultural area. It's very rich, very diversified. And it's a social, political and economic arena. And it's there are many different landscapes there, many different political landscapes and different qualities of life. When you're talking about the French Antilles, which is the case of Guadeloupe, you add another level of complexity, because here we're talking about a region of France and hence a region of Europe. It's an ultra-peripheral region of the European Union. We'll come back to that quality of being on the outskirts and the vulnerability that induces in terms of economics as well. And farming has a role to play in terms of food security. The unusual thing about the Caribbean is, and the unique feature of Guadeloupe, is that their relationships really are outward looking and always have been, particularly in the farming sector. So farming activity is the dominant activity, and it's structured around exports, so it's outward looking, and therefore is not designed to satisfy the needs of the local population. So it's raison d'être, if you like. That means that the context is one of dependency. So these economies are very small in scale. They're island economies that we're talking about, very small markets. We have supply and demand, which are both limited. We have resources which are limited, and therefore there are difficulties in trying to develop economies of scale to bring costs down. The fact of being an island is also synonymous with isolation, and that will increase transport costs. So that being said, these characteristics of the small island economies have nurtured unique strategies for development based on specializing in farming. And these this niche type of farming is focused on exports. I've already mentioned that. So these are single crops, huge amounts of single crops which are exported. So all of the wealth that is created has to, even today, depends on this single crop that is exported. So there's a ginormous concentration of production, just like the agro-industrial sector. There's a lot of chemical products used, selection of species, etc. And that disconnects the produce from where the crop is grown and where the crop is consumed. In Guadeloupe, despite the predominance of export crops, we also have an omnipresence of small-scale family farming, which has always coexisted with these big industrial export operations. Esther this morning suggested that it's mid-scale farming that could possibly rise to the challenge of securing the food supply. In Guadeloupe, on the other hand, it's small family-scale farms which will rise to that challenge. But that does bring with it quite a few problems, and I'll get back to those. So small-scale family farming is local, it's devoted to the domestic market, and production is market gardening, it's survival food, it's production of ingredients that are indigenous, production stems from different types of systems. There are polyculture, polybreeding systems. That is one of the characteristics in the French Antilles. And the farming respects the principles of the circular economy. You can take a closer look at the different processes and techniques, but there's quite a lot of tradition in there. So these small-scale family farms may possibly rise to this challenge of eating in a different way in the French Antilles. So this question of eating differently, which is well established in the national scheme, in this EGalim law we've been talking about that's been passed in France. So the question is, how do you apply EGalim locally in Guadeloupe? And this is one of the questions which Esther raised this morning. Is the supply, as it exists today in Guadeloupe, is it sufficient? And is it sufficiently structured to satisfy these challenges which have been laid down in terms of standards and quotas? Will it be able to fit the bill in terms of agroecology, organics, these list of different characteristics? And I must point out another. So perhaps you could answer that question that you've just put yourself. Is there enough in terms of quality? Yeah, well, I'm just going to add another contextual element before I respond. And this is a definition of standards. It's important to note that the population, 80% of the population, the population produces 80% of its own, the population imports 80% of what it eats. So 80% of food is imported. So we have to make that sit with this national framework, which is quite ambiguous in terms of how consumption is structured, because for a long, long time, this law dates from 2013, but for a long time, national standards that in France, mainland France, were different to those in the Antilles. So for the imported food was often too salty, too sugary. Now, the criteria of food security is bringing on board local supplies. So this EGalim law that we have in France aims to bring mid-scale farming back into the picture. So we have seen that there are labels that guarantee quality. In the French Antilles, we have the organic label, of course. However, if we take a look at the supply side of things, we've got one organic provider out of 20, so that's a really tiny proportion of the land. So the question remains, how can this supply possibly satisfy demand? There's an organization called CRALIM. It's a think tank, if you like, and it broaches subjects of securing the food chain. And they were talking about reducing that 20% threshold to 10%, so that today we make sure that the local supply can satisfy the population's needs. Another unique characteristic of the French Antilles is that production is so-called agroecological, but there are no labels. There is no way of legitimizing these practices. We note the difficulties that rise up when one is trying to meet the objectives of the EGalim law. So there is supply in terms of potential, because small family farming accounts for 70% of farms. where we live, and that's a lot. However, farms are not structured into a professional association, for example, and such associations are the only organizations that are recognized by the Ministry for Agriculture or are recognized to receive subsidies for the farmers, etc. In other words, we have a bit of a hurdle here that typifies what goes on in Guadeloupe. And the farmers say that they cannot join these professional associations because they focus on monolithic industries and focus on yield the whole time, whereas when you've got a family-run farm, you're talking very small scale. So under 2 hectares per farm, really. And they also say that they cannot ensure that their yield will be constant. So it's very difficult for them in terms of organization. It's hard to organize their supply. And another organizational issue that was mentioned earlier on here this morning, and that is growers' ability to be in direct contact with the consumers and to wear several hats at the same time. So in the French Antilles, we have our intermediaries who are very few and far between. They are actors which will bring together the farmers with the logistics providers, but the time being, it's the farmers who are who are in charge of the logistics too. And so, which brings me on to my final point. We have an area called Nord Grande Terre, which is really where all of the produce is grown, and that area has developed a mid-scale food project around an industrial plant, because this is one of the other nodes that we have where we can store fresh foods, process them, and then make sure that they are sold on to mass catering, for example. So I've put some figures on the screen here. This project to create a workshop will prepare 10,000 meals per day, mainly for mass catering in the region itself. Here we're talking about protecting this small family-scale farming and those traditional farming techniques, and it's also a question of winning over the consumers and teaching them about taste, because people are too used to eating that over-salty, over-sugary imported food. So it really is a question of educating the local population to encourage them to eat locally. So it's the way vegetables and fruit are grown is environmentally friendly, but there are no labels to show that. And I'd just like to finish and wrap up with a thought which is one of localness. We're in a territory which is small in size, and so obligatorily everybody is close, and we will all be able to look together in one and the same direction. And we note that categories of closeness, of localness, are very fragmented. This question of localness is broken down, if you like, because one geographical closeness isn't really important, because we import most of the food that we consume, 80%, I said earlier on. The question of having local organizations doing things together is not really very popular in Guadeloupe. It's very hard to organize the small-scale farms into an association, for example. The ability of looking together in the same direction for the future is on the table. It's a question we have to talk about when we try to identify how farming will develop in the future to meet these needs of food security. Thank you very much for listening to me. Thank you, everybody. I could wrap up by saying that getting local produce in canteens means that the offer has to be structured. We need political commitment, and that goes hand in hand with the social demand. We have seen that the computer is doing its best to try and show us these pictures that Marilyn has been drawing. So because our sketcher isn't a specialist in questions of food security, but she's just summing up what she hears in the form of a picture. But these pictures will be used in our debate when we open the debate for the floor, as we're going to do right now. Would anybody like to get the ball rolling and ask the first question? Nabil, perhaps, has a question. We've only got one mic that's working now, sadly, so we'll try and get the second one fixed during the lunch break. Hello. Yes, I was struck by what you were saying about Guadeloupe and how difficult it is all to look in the same direction. And that question of what kind of farming should be promoted, what kind of platforms do you use? And what's the content of the debate? What are these different types of farming that could be showcased? Thank you very much for your question. A lot is at stake in terms of constructing these platforms. We've got this region in the north, Nord-Grand-Terre, offers a platform where debates can take place, because there is this talk about creating this factory for processing the food. The first stones were laid earlier this year, and the challenge is now to get producers and consumers involved to talk about how we consume, how we can promote local food. And it's a question of public health, of course, also, because all of this imported food, which is too oily, too sweet, too salty, is causing a lot of health problems, such as obesity. There's over 30% of the locals are obese, whereas the national average in France is 18%. So there is a platform within this part of the north of the island, and it is aiming to showcase and promote small-scale family farming and getting those small farms to feed the local population rather than using the imports. There's the Kralim, which I mentioned, is also another platform which can bring together all policies pertaining to healthcare and food, and that is where debate is going to be fostered with civil society. No. I'm Pauline Ricard. I work for the police department, and I'm in charge of agriculture, and I'm in charge of one of the platforms that we're going to be talking about later on. I had a question for Valérie. I'd like to know if you work with Martinique, which I'm sure has similar problems to yours in Guadeloupe. Yes, indeed. Indeed we do. They have the same challenges, the same issues to face. Apart from the fact that in Martinique, there have been more initiatives on a local scale deployed by the farmers and other authorities. So the islands are sister islands, but they don't have the same dynamic. In 2009, growers got together to suggest local produce. There really was a development of different forms of groupings, associations, to address the question of food security. In Guadeloupe, it's been triggered by research and the role that INRA has played to get things moving. I've got a question for all of the speakers in terms about the regulations, because things seem to be totally locked up. We've got this single European market, etc. I think the problem of local sourcing for mass catering and institutions in general is not unique to France. I think all European countries must be facing the same issues. Is there not some kind of room for manoeuvre that we can dream up together amongst different countries? I'm not sure if all of the speakers can come back to me on that. So the question is how to talk with Europe about this. We have Europeans and non-Europeans in the room, so everyone is free to join in the conversation. I'd like to come back on something which was said earlier on. One thing that could really boost things in all local ecosystems and mid-scale systems is the question of how much these external elements cost. It's a question of measuring, identifying these external elements, and with ADEM we are working on this. We are a pilot company on these questions, and it's important to be able to quantify things. And once we have the data, we will be able to formulate demands, and that will mean that in the future we'll be able to get round this ban on local preference. I'm only sharing here our vision. It's the ADEM vision, because they really are working on this particular issue. But people can all have their own opinion.
Pierre-Noël aurait pu répondre également, je pense. En fait,
I believe I'm Valérie Bivard. I'm for the Regional Authority for the Environment and Biodiversity. I really do agree with what you just said about the fact that these external environmental factors have to be factored in, and that could clear up quite a few issues, including that about local products. However, for the time being, there is no tool for integrating these external factors into calls for tenders. A study has been launched, and it says quite clearly that it's essential that we have a simple-to-use tool. It has to be easy, clear, so that we can use these external factors, but we don't have that tool yet. And until we have such a tool, we can't include these factors. And this tool will only be possible if we all get around the table and we all are motivated to create this tool. And I'm sure this won't be possible between 2023, according to the research results. But before 2023, we will not be having such a tool at our disposal. Natasha Sotro from ITAB. I just want to back up what has just been said. I've worked with ADEME on all of these questions of indicators. I think the main challenge is that we've got an indicator which is fine. It's great for your carbon footprint. However, for agroecological systems, etc., it's less productive when you apply it to kilo per product. It's problematic because the results will be negative in terms of externality. The big groups use these factors. And in terms of biodiversity, we do not have any factors. Any ecologist will tell you that you cannot add up the different components, CO2, etc., the life cycle from beginning to end of the product's life. There are many challenges, and even beyond 2023, we're going to have some methodological issues. There will be more questions pertaining to biodiversity, not only impact, but also the service which is rendered. If you're talking about an environmental checklist, you've got many more factors to add, including service rendered, and that's very difficult to calculate. We could spend a whole couple of days talking about that. So I work with the company that carried out that research you were just referring to, and I know that many problems have been identified. Yes, I would like to... I'm in charge of mass catering in the city of Arles, here in the south. I want to say exactly what you've just said, and I would like also to say that the calculations that have been made on these external factors, there are 15 documents that have been published, but they do not enable us to choose local products at the end of the day. So a lot of work has to be carried out on these calculations because externality and the factors pertaining to externality do not help local produce. Well, in this EGalim law, why did we mention that point? Well, we work in many working groups. This point has been addressed because we cannot state it's a local product. We have to be able to have a local door in, and we found that the life cycle and the external environmental factors were a way of doing this. It's the only way that the lawmakers could bring in the local produce. And then, getting back to the EGalim law, in our regions, I'm in a mountain zone, I'll talk about it this afternoon. We have structured our meat industry with different practices, but we don't have a label. In the EGalim law, it's impossible to include this high-quality meat, which comes from the mountains, it's used in school canteens, but we don't have a standard to adhere to. So the environmental side it's been one way that we can include these quality produces in the EGalim law. We're going to talk about this later on this afternoon in the second right of it.
From the of Salford in Manchester, United Kingdom, and I'm doing a PhD looking at public food procurement, comparing the United Kingdom with Sweden and Denmark. Can people hear me? And on this question of local procurement, particularly with certain smaller communes in Sweden and Denmark, they make a lot of use of what they call direct procurement, which is the provision of European law that if you buy below a certain amount, I think 100,000 euros, but I'd have to check the figure, then you have no requirement to issue a tender. So it might be that you have a small producer of tomatoes, and then you can do a deal with that small producer of tomatoes that you will buy their harvest for certain months in the year, and do it without a tender. And then you might use your big tender to buy the tomatoes for the rest of the year when that small producer has none to sell.
Merci. Juste pour faire suite.
Thank you. Just to follow on from your intervention, and with regard to how you can work your way around the European laws, it's true that in France, as compared to countries of the west of Europe, I'm not sure about Eastern Europe, we have the strictest rules. We can purchase on the market for sums of less than 4,000 euros without a public tender. So our legislation is actually far more constraining than that in the United Kingdom or in Italy, where in Italy they've managed to use pre-European laws, local laws. I think they were actually passed down from the Middle Ages, in fact, which gives them more leeway. So just a word about the question of environmental indicators. I work in a lab where we're working on how we can develop an indicator that is more appropriate to talk about territorial development rather than life cycles. The challenge of these environmental indicators is that they rely on the fact that geographical proximity gives less of a carbon footprint. But between an old truck and a small new van, the truck has a far greater carbon footprint than the small new van. So, in fact, that's not the right entry point for an indicator. We need to have a multiple indicator that is based on what the benefit is for the territorial level, for the mid-scale level. So the environmental indicators won't help us there, especially as behind there's the lobby of the big French majors where they're better at life cycle analysis, carbon footprints, and different environmental aspects. It's the big groups, therefore, that promote the fact that the norms correspond to the way they operate, and therefore the more hybrid, smaller sectors and more multiplayer sectors can't play the same game. Final question before lunch break. Thank you, Mathilde Coudray from an association. I just wanted to talk about Europe. Maybe recall and inform you that there is a European group working on the implementation of a common food policy and not a common agricultural policy in order to really extend the questions to the question of food itself and not to focus solely on production. And one of the objectives of this policy is to ensure that the different levels of governance at the European and national and local scales are more coherent. So I do encourage you to look at the work of IPES Food if you're interested in investigating this subject further.
Il t'appelait Pauline ou à côté de Valérie, non? Cet après-midi, il y aura 2 tables rondes encore. Oui.
This afternoon there will be 2 round tables where we touch upon these topics.
Are you all right to continue?
So this is a question for Pierre-Noël, because I did the same as Albert. I listened to the debates at the Parliament for this Egaline law, and with some hindsight, I wonder why they never mentioned short circuits. They don't talk about local circuits, and if somebody from Argentina can sell to mass catering and consider to be a short circuit. I don't understand, because I don't understand why this notion of short circuit was used as an indicator.
Encore une fois, il ne faut pas confondre ce que peut dire
Once again, we mustn't mix up what law stipulates and national policies. Since 2016, we've had a guide of local purchases. It's called Localim. It's the regional agency for the environment has also created a guide for the local purchase of fruits and vegetables at the regional level. So the idea that the government supports local purchases is there, but we cannot put it in the law. That's not possible. The possibilities of encouraging local purchases does come from these local circuits by the fact of that we raise awareness within the local community. So there are ways of getting around things. This is a short-term approach. It's not a European modification of public tender laws. And the idea of using environmental externalities, I'm rather pessimistic in the short term. In the mid-term, I'm not sure that it will solve the problem of everything local. So the cost of transport that has a lesser impact than production methods, I do not believe will allow us to have a promote local produce. So, but there are ways of getting around the problem of public tenders.